normally what I would do is ask you to raise your hand to tell me if you think the crowd on the left is larger. Okay, how many people think the crowd on the right is larger? Raise your hand. Okay, the reason I ask this is because these were the source of incredible debate approximately 2 years ago when Donald Trump was inaugurated as the new president of the United States. His crowd at his inauguration was posted online compared to the crowd of Barack Obama's initial presidential inauguration at the exact same place at the exact same time 8 years earlier. And it led to a lot of conflict, in part because in the first meeting of the press secretary of the United States, Sean Spicer claimed that the audience at Donald Trump's inauguration was the largest to ever witness a presidential inauguration, both in person and around the globe. What you can see here, of course, is the pictures he showed at his press conference were from behind the president when he was taking the oath of office. Obviously, it was large from behind the view of the president for either inauguration. What's critical is when you zoom back and look how far that crowd goes. Now, when the press secretary was confronted on this by the media, who pointed out that these pictures suggested it was a lie, and that ridership numbers on the subway revealed that it seemed to be a lie. Another member of the White House, Kellyanne Conway, famously said to the press, "You're saying it's a falsehood," but our press secretary, Sean Spicer, gave alternative facts. Now, when she essentially coined the term alternative facts, it raised a lot of red flags. It also inspired people to think back to where they had heard a similar type of language. And many people were inspired to think back about the lesson from George Orwell's famous book, 1984. And I think the quote that struck me the most from his book in terms of its similarity was that the line, "The party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears." It was their final, most essential command. And after Kellyanne Conway made that comment and people drew the parallels to 1984, the book moved back to the top of the bestseller list, and its sales increased 8,500%. Pretty dramatic change in the sales of a single book, in part because people wanted to think more about what was going on here. What was the dynamics here between the new government and the psychology of individuals as they were observing things, and what control did the party have versus the power of your own senses to observe the world around you. Now, this has been a broader issue that has attracted an enormous amount of attention in the United States. I know Britain around Brexit. Other countries are dealing with this as well. In a survey in 2016 by Pew Research Center, they found that a majority say fake news has left Americans confused about basic facts. Specifically, 64% of U.S. adults who said completely made-up news has caused them a great deal of confusion about basic current events, whereas only 11% said it had created no confusion or not much confusion. So this is something that has been on the forefront in the last couple of years, trying to understand how people get their news, what's the quality of that news, and this has only been exacerbated with the development of the internet and social media, where individuals can create a fake news site and generate six-figure salaries almost instantaneously by just churning out nonsense, essentially. And what has happened is it has inspired researchers to go back and look at the political science, psychology, the neuroscience behind this. So I'm going to show you a study of roughly 1,400 voters that came out shortly after this debate about crowd sizes. It was conducted by political scientists, and they asked people across the country to look at the following two photos, photo A and photo B, and they compared the judgments of Trump versus Clinton voters. And they simply asked them, which photo has more people? And in the condition I'm going to show you, they didn't tell participants which was from Clinton or Trump voters, but obviously many people had seen these in the news and had been influenced by the press and the way that the White House was talking about them. Now, this should be an easy task for most of you, and in fact it is. About 99% of people, 98% of people get it right among non-voters, and almost 99% of Clinton voters get the answer to this correct, but 1 in 6 Trump voters gets it wrong. And they reported that the crowd on the left, which was obviously smaller, was in fact had more people. And I've since given this to my own kids who are 6 and 8 years old, and it's pretty easy for them to see what's going on with the visual image presented in front of them. So what's going on in the minds of people who are giving the wrong answer to what appears to be an easy question? So this basically is my origin story for this research question. I was puzzled too, and there's lots of interesting reasons why this might be happening, but this really forced me in my lab to kind of go back to the drawing board and think about what is going on psychologically when people are coming to different conclusions about the exact same evidence. And the two threads in the research we've been conducting that drive home what we think is one of the key parts of this puzzle is that humans have highly partisan brains. Now, that manifests in different ways. In different cultures, our groupishness gets attached to different types of identities, different types of groups than it does in America with the Democrats and Republicans. I'm Canadian, so I'm from a very different political system, but you still see this attachment to political parties and other groups, national identities, all kinds of other movements. And that seems to drive a lot of how we engage with information and generate beliefs. And that has led us to think more about how partisanship, and what is it about partisan identities that drives us to believe one thing over the other. So I'm going to show you basically two parts to this story today. One is that I'm going to present research from psychology and from neuroscience, providing evidence that we do have highly partisan brains, and then I'll pivot to what the consequences are for your belief system. So this is data over the last 25 years in the United States. And what you can see is that at one point in this country, not that long ago, there was an enormous amount of overlap between the political ideology of people, whether they were liberal or conservative, and their party identification. What that meant is that there were a lot of liberal Republicans and a lot of conservative Democrats. But what you can see over time is that there's an increasing degree to which people are sorting themselves into partisan identities in ways that align with their political ideology. And this has been basically increasing rapidly in the last few years, and it's only increased, I believe, since 2017, based on data that we've looked at and lots of real-world evidence. So what you can see basically is the pulling apart of the country into two ideologically distinct tribes. Now, where does this come from? There is evidence from political scientists, John Hibbing and his colleagues have found that political ideology, roughly 50% of it is determined by our genetics. And so they do that with twin studies comparing the political beliefs of identical twins with non-identical twins. However, there doesn't seem to be a strong genetic basis for whether you're partisan or not, more or less partisan. So it really is that you have this ideological orientation, and what seems to be happening is that gets attached to parties based on messaging from elites, aspects of your community around you, and the policy positions that they take. And so what we've been trying to study is how do people construct these group identities, and why does it become attractive for people to sort in to these identities based on ideology? And the conclusion that certainly we have reached, as well as I think this is something that has reached kind of the public consciousness in the last couple of years here, is that people are incredibly tribal or partisan. This has deep evolutionary origins. So if you look at a list of human universals, things that every culture, every studied on Earth has, one thing they have in common is that every culture on Earth ever studied is coalitional. What that means is people quickly form coalitions or groups and work together to achieve common goals. So they can cooperate to do something they couldn't ordinarily do. Now, how that gets played out in modern politics looks like team sports, where people become fans of a soccer team or a hockey team, and that guides them to, judge what's, to align their efforts with the team, to feel a strong sense of connection to the team, even if they're not part of it, even if they're just watching at home on TV, to feel vicarious joy when the team succeeds or wins, and a sense of status if their team does well, and feel shame or anxiety or fear when their team loses power or it does something that is shameful. Now, what we think is happening is that this same process that plays out has played out throughout human history with countless kinds of coalitions, and plays out with sports and national identities, does the same thing in the political domain. And so I'm going to show you a study that was conducted, led actually by my colleague Mina Chikara. And we decided to look at whether there is a neural foundation for partisanship. And so we brought people into our lab. Well, actually, this started with a study at Carnegie Mellon when Mina was there. And we essentially just flipped a coin to create two teams. And we assigned people on the basis of this coin flip that was entirely randomly determined to put them on a team. And then we looked at whether the patterns of brain activation, when they were looking and thinking about members of their arbitrary in-group versus out-group that we had created on the basis of a coin flip, were also used to encode members of their political in-group and out-group, so Democrats and Republicans. And so this was done over a period of 1 to 2 weeks where people came in, they did a short personality questionnaire, and we randomly assigned them to a team, giving them false feedback about their personality. And we assigned them to teams called the Rattlers or the Eagles, which was a tribute to very famous work by Sharif and colleagues, where they had brought kids in who were 12 years old and basically randomly assigned them to a cabin and conflict between the teams. And so we were basically just doing the same thing without actual conflict. Then we brought them back and scanned them. And we looked at whether the patterns of brain activation using a multivoxel pattern classifier, when they were seeing members of their arbitrary in-group or out-group, the Eagles or the Rattlers, were the same patterns. We could use those patterns to decode whether they were seeing members of their political in-group or out-group. Okay. And indeed, this is what we found. And this paper was published last year in JP General. And in particular, what we found is that when people trained on these arbitrary groups by seeing members of the Eagles and the Rattlers, when we tested them with these political groups, we found patterns of activation across the anterior insula, the ACC, prefrontal cortex, and consistently across all these regions, using a searchlight analysis, we found that better than a chance, we were accurate at predicting who they were looking at in terms of political groups based on how they encoded in-group members for these arbitrary groups. And we also included a neutral group to see if this was driven by an enhancement of in-group members or a neglect of out-group members. And the results were consistent in that it was driven by an in-group advantage. And so what seems to be happening here is people are encoding who their in-group is. They tend to be, I think, more maybe ignoring or not paying a ton of attention to the out-group. And then they use that information about in-group to look and identify other in-groups. And so this basically just suggests that there's neural foundations for partisanship that are grounded in something much more basic and primitive than politics. That the way that we think of chunk up the world into us and them on the basis of a coin flip is part of the same process that we use to determine who's with us or against us on politics and probably other identities, from race to nationality. So those are obviously questions that could be just, should be investigated in future research. But that's certainly what we believe, and we certainly found evidence for it here in the domain of politics, which is somewhat surprising because people often think of politics as purely ideological, and it's really driven by genetics and is laden with morality and history and conflict, all these things. But you can find that you remove all those things and create simple in-groups and out-groups based on a coin flip, and you find similar patterns of activation. Now, in the modern world, we interact with our groups and express our identities heavily through social media. And if you go to the Wall Street Journal, you can find this great page they developed called Blue Feed, Red Feed. And you can enter all these political topics in American politics, from immigration to Trump versus Clinton during the election. And what you can see is they show you a snapshot of the Facebook feeds of somebody who would be an extreme liberal versus an extreme conservative as the exact same issue is being presented in the news. And it shows you different news sites often hyper-partisan news sites from the left and right, and how they present news about the exact same topics in real time. And what you're seeing, and what you should definitely try if you haven't done this before, is the kind of ideological and identity-based bubble that people get in. And it actually is really jarring to see how radically different news sites are covering the exact same news at the exact same moment. And what we don't realize often is that we end up in one of these bubbles, and algorithms, by software companies like Facebook partly determine what we see. And they're doing that based on what will keep you engaged. And they're trying to predict what's going to get you to click or like something to increase advertising revenue. So there's a huge incentive for them to do this. But what it does is it basically puts us into bubbles where we're getting a very extreme kind of news if we're an ideological individual. Obviously, if you don't engage a lot with politics, you probably just see cat videos. You wouldn't see these things. But these are certainly what people who on the extreme ends of the left and right see. Now, work in my lab, led by Billy Brady and Julian Wills, also with colleagues in political psychology, John Jost, in political science, Josh Tucker, analyzed roughly 500,000 tweets to find out what might be driving this. And in particular, first we found that when people use moral emotional language on Twitter, and these are just everyday people like yourselves or myself, those are the messages that are more likely to get shared or retweeted by others. In fact, what we found is a very robust effect size estimate such that for every additional moral emotional word you put in a tweet, there's a 15 to 20% chance it'll be retweeted. And that sounds great, but when we actually, and so you can see why that's part of clickbait, is like these emotionally and morally arresting or engaging comments. Now, what we found is that when we started to code the ideology of people who were on Twitter and engaging in these discussions around issues like gun control, same-sex marriage, climate change, we could determine how far left or right they were. And what we found is that when they were talking about these issues and not using moral emotional language, they weren't sharing as much, but they were also more likely to share things from people they disagree with. The moment they started using this moral emotional language, what was correlated with that was what you see here, which is essentially echo chambers. That it was going, these messages were more likely to go viral, but they were only going viral within like-minded people. And so this is essentially the bubbles that we create when we use what I offhandedly call tribal language. So this type of language with moral emotions, like shame or disgusting or I'm so angry, is powerful in signaling who we are in a group and resonates with people in that group, but it doesn't connect with people who are different than us. And it's unlikely to get them to engage with it or share it to their own networks. And so what our data suggests, and admittedly this is correlational data, but we're running some causal studies that I don't have time to tell you about today, suggest that these moral emotions do divide. And we've now found similar things with other samples and other topics. So this seems to be a very robust phenomenon. Okay, so why should you care about what's happening online? Well, as I'm sure many of you are aware, has become a major issue in many countries that because of these tribal instincts that we have inherited from our ancestors, we can be easily manipulated by foreign agents who understand our psychology and play to it. So this is an example of what Russian propaganda looked like not too long ago. And it's kind of funny to look back on it, but this is when I think of Russian propaganda. This is certainly the thing that comes to my mind. Shows like a strong military and a giant leader, the industry in the background and all the planes, obviously the flag and the national colors. This is what it looks like now. So this is the type of Russian propaganda that was presented to Americans as if it was given by accounts that were driven by Russian trolls and Russian bots on Facebook and Twitter and other social media. It looks almost nothing like you'd think propaganda would look like. And so we don't really have a good script for filtering this out or rejecting it on its face. The other thing is that when I've looked through this, I've looked through hundreds of these now, these different propaganda messages that have been sorted out by people at Twitter and Facebook who are trying to clean this up. What you see is images and language that's heavily linked to morality and partisanship. And so here you see Hillary Clinton, and she's basically got devil horns. She's fighting Jesus. At the bottom, you see this is from the army of Jesus, and you're supposed to like it or share it if you want Jesus to win. And so basically, this is using partisanship with your political opponent and showing them as evil. They're literally the devil in this image, and they're fighting against Jesus, who's the more, for people on the religious conservatives, this is the most upstanding representative of their moral and value belief system. And so this is the type of language that Russia was using to push our buttons with these fake online ads. And they were designed, and they did this for the left too. They presented images that made figures on the left look heroic and figures on the right look evil. And what they were trying to do is mobilize people, I think, to support Trump. That's what Putin has said, but also to divide people, pull them apart, sow conflict, undercut democracy. I'm sure you're all aware now that Cambridge Analytica, just down the road from you guys, was involved in this and working closely with psychologists. They were, when Christopher Wiley blew the whistle on Cambridge Analytica, he admitted that this was driven by political psychology studies. And when I read his article, they were almost identical to studies that were conducted by my colleagues at NYU on different types of personality between liberals and conservatives and how you might appeal to them or push their buttons. Obviously, there's a growth in fake news that's a growing problem. And in fact, the most talked about and widely shared paper published in Science Magazine this year analyzed fake news and found that falsehoods, so in other words, fake news, diffuse significantly farther, faster, deeper, and more broadly than the truth in all categories of information. And the effects were more pronounced for false political news than for false news about terrorism, natural disasters, science, urban legends, or financial information. So, and this basically means that fake news is powerful. And a lot of people who've been reading this lately have been referencing this famous quote by Mark Twain: "A lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is putting on its shoes," which I think is a really apt and powerful quote. Unfortunately, this is also fake news. This quote cannot be attributed to Mark Twain. So yet another form of fake news that seems like it might be real. It fits our preconceptions, and we're inclined to want to share it. Okay, so this information is coming in, and we have these partisan brains. How do these shape our beliefs? So I recently published a paper in Trends in Cognitive Science, Sciences with Andrea Pereira, where she was here last year as a postdoc. And we were trying to understand, through the lens of neuroeconomic models of value, how people place value on some information over others, and how this influences different types of cognitive processing throughout the brain. And we think this is not just an issue for politics. It might affect whether or not we say we think the crowd on the Trump inauguration was bigger than the Obama inauguration, but it also seems like this might play a role in whether or not we value scientific findings on things like climate change, or dismiss them or devalue them, and how we feel about things like vaccination. So whether or not we trust scientists and scientific reports on the effects of vaccination on things like autism, and whether or not we then are willing to vaccinate our own kids. These types of issues are not as trivial as crowd-sized discussions. These climate change and vaccination affect millions, potentially billions of lives. And so it's critically important that we have a science of understanding belief. And since these issues have all become politicized in the United States and other countries, they start to get filtered through the lens of partisan identities. And that's why we think that understanding our partisan brains can not only tell us about things like crowd size of different political candidates, but also how people approach evidence and science about many other issues, since they often, for many reasons, get filtered through political lens. I also think that the way that I think about this can be summarized beautifully in what is my favorite New Yorker cartoon, where you see two armies going to war, and they both have flags with the exact same image, and it's the famous Wittgenstein duck-rabbit illusion. And one military leader says to his army, "There can be no peace until they renounce the rabbit god and accept our duck god." And we think that a lot of debates are like this, that people are looking at information that's ambiguous and interpreting it through their own lens, and it becomes a source of enormous conflict and debate. And so what we think is going on here is the reason identities might carry so much value and lead us to believe some things over others is because our political identities, for example, fulfill numerous goals. They are groups that we feel a sense of belonging. They tell us what to do or what the nature of the world is, which fills our needs, epistemic goals. They often have existential goals attached to them. They tell stories about our future and what our meaning is in society and culture. They certainly fulfill status goals. If our party wins an election, we might be likely to celebrate or feel good when we go into work the next day. And if our favorite candidate loses, I know lots of people who've cried after their candidate lost, even if they weren't engaged in the election. It also fulfills system goals, so different parties have different beliefs about the history of the country and how they can best uphold that. And then finally, morality is a critical part of politics too. Our political parties give us information about what is right and what is wrong. Now, all of these things are guiding us to place a value on certain beliefs. And in many cases, these can be opposed to our accuracy goals. Sometimes these align with our accuracy goals. So you might have an identity as a scientist, and you feel like you belong. It gives you status in society. It tells you a certain sense of morality about right and wrong and how to do good science and use large samples and have valid measures and be transparent. All of those things are part of your scientific identity. And so those can actually be a type of identity that increases value on accuracy. But many people don't have the identity as a scientist or a journalist or a juror or somebody who has these goals aligned with accuracy. And so when that happens, as often happens in politics, they are often in opposition and can outweigh the value that we place on certain beliefs. And so we think of this, for many people, looks like a tug of war between their identity goals and their accuracy goals. And whichever is stronger in the moment is more likely to guide the value that they place on certain pieces of information and the beliefs that they forge. So if you think back to the initial example I gave you about the crowd sizes at Press Secretary Sean Spicer's press conference, he said that Donald Trump's inauguration had the largest audience ever to witness an inauguration. Now, why might people believe that? Or at least say they believe it. We obviously don't know exactly what's happening in their brains. But the reason that they value what he says and are willing to report it to scientists who are studying this is, for Republicans, their identity might be fulfilled by a sense of belonging to this group. The group has high status because they just won the election. And if Trump is saying he has the biggest crowds ever, maybe that means he has status over even previous presidents from his own or other parties. And there's other goals as well. And since those are strong for many people, that might make them outweigh accuracy when they're making these judgments. And so we're very interested in that. And when we think about, so we've been looking at how this plays out with fake news, recently doing behavioral and fMRI studies. And we also are interested in how this plays out with fake news that's not political. So I know Britain has a great tradition of tabloids. I think maybe you're the world leader in tabloids, but America has a great tradition of tabloids too. Like these different news. When I grew up, when I would go, to the grocery store with my grandparents, they would often end up buying a magazine like the ones you see here. These are real magazine covers from what was fake news in the 1980s or 90s when I was growing up. And so there was still stuff about politics back then, but it was clearly weird and didn't make any sense, like Hillary Clinton adopting an alien baby. But there was also fake news about things that really had nothing to do with politics, like bat child escapes. In fact, there was a whole series about bat child. And so that is going to be a type of fake news that doesn't have the burden of identity goals dictating what you believe, whereas ones about people like Hillary Clinton might. And so we decided to also run studies kind of comparing those things. And this is all a series of studies run with Andrea Pereira, and it's currently under review. So I welcome any suggestions or questions at the end about it. But just, I want to pause there and ask, just check how much more time I have for me to go through these studies.
So we still have 15 minutes, and we can take some time for questions, but...
Okay, so 15 minutes to present the studies, or should I maybe present one study and go right to questions?
So after you, really. I think a lot of viewers here would be interested in seeing all the studies.
Okay, so I'll go through the studies in about 10 minutes, and then I'll be happy to stay online however long for the questions. So what we wanted to test in these studies is there's been a lot of ideas floating around about what drives our beliefs. One is that we look for evidence that confirms our pre-existing beliefs. Another hypothesis is that our ideology guides us to believe certain things. So if you're liberal, you're more likely to believe things that support your values of peace. For example, in conservative look for evidence that supports their ideology around, tradition, or partisanship might play a role. Certainly all three of these might play a role. And so we ran a study where we used real quotes. We thought the same process that drive beliefs plays out for real and fake news. So we started with looking at real quotes from Trump and Clinton. They've been in the spotlight a long time and have been kind of on the both side of every issues. And then we pulled different quotes of theirs that either were consistent with liberal values on the Short's value scale based on previous research, like equality, environmental protection, peace, honesty, or conservative values with security, tradition, success. And we wanted to see if what happens if Clinton says something that's pro-liberal values versus pro-conservative values. What happens when Trump says something that was pro-liberal values and pro-conservative values? What did people believe? Obviously, in this case, all these are true quotes, so they should believe everything. But this way we can see if they just believe the person they like or values that they hold dear. And so here's some quotes very briefly about that held value of peace versus undermined it. So Hillary Clinton received an award for her work to ease decades-long conflict in Northern Ireland versus she voted in favor of the Iraq war resolution. So that undermined a liberal value. Donald Trump opposed the Iraq war at one point in 2003, but he also said he supported the Iraq war before that. And so these are all real, genuine facts, and so we were able to present them to everybody and see what they believed. And so if people just believe in their ideology, sorry, the other things aren't showing, they should just believe the things that uphold their values. So they might believe everything that's focused on peace, if you're a liberal, is something that you're more likely to believe is true. Whereas from a partisanship perspective, they should only believe the things that advance their partisan beliefs. So liberals should only believe things that Hillary Clinton said that are good and Trump said that are bad, and vice versa for conservatives. And so for all these hypotheses, we thought Democrats and Republicans would show the opposite effect. And that's exactly what we found. So this is each dot is a participant in the study. And what we found is that among liberals who valued peace, on the quotes that I showed you about peace, they were more likely to believe the data about when Clinton said something, or when we showed them a quote about Clinton upholding peace, like the Northern Ireland peace agreement, and they were more likely to disbelieve that she voted to invade Iraq. On the other hand, when they read the Trump quotes, they were the opposite. They believed that Trump wanted to go to Iraq and didn't believe the quote that Trump didn't want to go to Iraq. And so clearly here, our Democrats were biased. They were selectively believing the things that aligned with their partisan values or partisan identity. And if you look among Republicans, you see the exact opposite, in the sense that they only believe things that were bad about Clinton and good about Trump that upheld their values. And so what both parties were doing, pretty much to the exact same extent, was generating beliefs about news that were aligned with their partisan goals and partisan identities. We also did this with conservative values, just for balance. So here we looked at security. So like Clinton supported the Osama bin Laden raid. Trump wanted to defeat ISIS, versus they did things that undermined support for security. And we found almost the exact same thing. Again, highly significant three-way interaction, p less than 0.001, where people were partisan. They believed the things that upheld their values about their own candidate, but believed the things that undermine those values for the other candidate, rather than just believing all the things that upheld their values. And so what this suggests is that partisanship was driving people's beliefs. We also ran a study with fake news. So those are all real news, but in this case, we presented fake news, like Hillary Clinton wore a secret earpiece during the debate. Florida just Democrats voted to impose Sharia law, or fake news about Republicans, like Trump enacts a one-child law for minorities, or Trump's running mate Vice President Mike Pence was caught suppressing up to 10,000 black votes. And what we found, again, very consistent with the first study, is that going from real news now to fake news, people believed fake news stories that affirmed the things that supported their partisan values. So Republicans believed the bad stories about Democrats, like Clinton wore an earpiece, and Democrats believed the bad fake news stories about Republicans. And so basically what it did again, and this was again a very strong, these are some of those robust effects I've ever seen actually. Partisanship was driving their belief in fake news. Now, we also added a control condition here where we presented nonpartisan fake news like Bat Boy to see what is kind of the baseline. Are Democrats and Republicans just believing any bullshit and then correcting for things that they don't like? Or do they have a default of belief? And so we presented stories like Leonardo DiCaprio flew an eyebrow artist 7,500 miles to do his brows for the Oscars, or one that's closer to home for you guys, alcoholic Camilla thrown into a royal rehab. We presented, I think it was 8 different fake news stories that had nothing to do about politics, or certainly American politics. And what we found was interesting is for these stories like about Bat Boy, what you see is that in this control condition, you found a difference between Republicans and Democrats. Republicans believed this fake news that had nothing about politics, and in fact, they believed it almost exactly as much as they believe fake news about Hillary Clinton. And so what this suggests is that for Republicans, their default seems to be believe fake news unless it's bad about their own candidate, like Donald Trump, and then they don't believe it. So they kind of start with the default of belief and then correct for it, where, sorry, the bar's not working here, but if you look at the far left of this graph, Democrats were doing the exact opposite. Their default seems to disbelieve any fake news unless it's bad news about Trump, and then they believe it. And so their default is disbelief, whereas for Republicans, their default is belief or credulity. And so this was something that was one of those reasons why it's always used to have a control condition, because everything I've shown you up until now is about the similarities between Republicans and Democrats based on identity. But once you take identity out of the equation, there are genuine differences between people on the left and right that are tell us something about the nature of beliefs that's driven by ideology and not by identity. And so for Democrats, the default is belief, unless they like the news. And for Republicans, or disbelief. And for Republicans, the default is to believe something, unless they dislike it. Okay, I'll go to the very last study. As I said before, there's been a number of polls on fake news belief. And about 1 in 4 Americans report sharing fake news, whether aware of it at the time or not. I have actually shared at least 2 or 3 fake news stories. And thankfully, a lot of my friends on social media are scientists and call me out when I do this. And as I said, this news is important because it disseminates very quickly. Now, we looked at whether people or not share fake news. And what you see is Democrats don't really share fake news very much. But Republicans do. And so this is another difference between the left and right. Republicans share political fake news. They don't share this non-political fake news about Bat Boy, even though they believe it. So certainly our beliefs are correlated with our sharing and predict sharing, but there's a difference here between Republicans and Democrats where they are particularly likely to share fake news. And so that's another difference between the left and the right. So I'm going to go to the very, oh wait, maybe I don't have the last study. Okay, I'm just going to sum up. We read another story where we actually created our own fake news and basically came to the exact same conclusion. So this was based on what I would call real fake news. These are real stories that were fake, but we created our own fake news and made it actually totally identical for the left and right, and we found almost identical results. And so what we find over and over again is that Democrats and Republicans are both more likely to believe news when that belief fulfills identity goals. So they want to believe things that uphold their values when in-group members do them, but they want to believe things that undermine their values when out-group members do them. So they don't just want to believe things that uphold their values. It really depends who's doing it that matters. And so that was similar, almost identical across Democrats and Republicans. But where you get a difference between them is that Republicans are more likely to share news on social media when it fulfills identity goals. Democrats are not. And in fact, if you looked in the lead up to the election, the most popular fake news stories were negative ones about Clinton or positive ones about Trump. Like the most popular one that was shared over 1 million times on social media was that the Pope endorsed Donald Trump, and that was not true. But those types of stories tend to resonate more, and we think the reason is because there's something about Republicans that makes them more likely to share these types of messages with their social networks. And the other thing that was interesting is that there's a difference in kind of your default belief, such that Republicans are more likely to believe apolitical news about things like Bat Boy than Democrats. And so what this suggests to us is that our identity goals seem to be driving belief, and that seems to matter more than just bolstering your personal values or confirming your stereotypes. And this is a quote from a former New York State Senator. He once said, very famously, that you are entitled to your own opinion, but you are not entitled to your own facts. But comedian Stephen Colbert has changed that. He said it used to be everyone was entitled to their own opinion, but not their own facts. But that's not the case anymore. Facts matter not at all. Perception is everything. And so I've been thinking about this a lot more lately. And my favorite book in the history of social psychology was written by Leon Festinger and colleagues, where they infiltrated a cult and examined the psychology of when a doomsday cult has its prophecy fail, when at midnight the spaceship doesn't come and the prophecy that they predicted turns out to be wrong. What they find is that in those studies, people actually increased their belief in the aliens. They didn't. It took them a long time before they would shake that belief. And in fact, after their belief was falsified, to use the scientific term, if anything, they actually doubled down on their belief and they went out into the media and proselytized and tried to tell other people that their belief system was true. And so a lot of times when you falsify beliefs from normal people, if their identity is so tightly connected to it and they're reinforced by their social community, those were two things that Festinger and colleagues pointed out that seem to be really critical for holding on to fake beliefs. And so the same type of psychology that seems to be driving cult beliefs in the face of contradictory evidence seems to be at play in politics. And as I said, this was the most popular news story in the election, the Pope Francis endorsing Donald Trump. And what you can see here is as it got close to election, people were sharing more news. The most popular news stories were fake news. And they became even more popular than real mainstream news from prominent news sites, news sources that were trusted, and that had social media networks with millions and millions of followers to get them out. Even with all those built-in advantages, fake news still won. So the psychology that fake news is tapping into is so important that it really seems to trump all the advantages that are normally built in with mainstream news. So with that, one thing we're thinking about now is how you can get people to be more self-critical, to value accuracy, and what you can do to open minds. And I'm happy to talk about those more. But I just want to thank you, and hopefully I've convinced you, maybe moved your priors a little bit towards the understanding that we have groupish and partisan brains, and these shape our beliefs. So this is my research team that helped me, so thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions.
Okay.
I'm going to turn off screen share so I can see you. Okay.
Hi, Jay. Thank you very much. My name's Ryan. I'm actually from Wisconsin, so I'm fairly familiar with what's going on in the state.
Yeah, Wisconsin's an important state.
Yeah, definitely. But my kind of question is, underlying a lot of the conservative, Republican, I know there is a lot of religious beliefs, and that was a few of the things that popped up with the Pope endorsing Trump, and then also with the Russians including Jesus and everything. I was just wondering if you have anything that you've done that in regards to that with religion and politics.
They're highly correlated, especially in the United States. I have not done anything with religion, although I know there's some studies that are interesting suggesting that people who are more religious are more likely to be intuitive and take things on faith, which is unsurprising. But I know recently one of those famous papers in Science failed to replicate. So I don't know where that literature is, but certainly it's correlated. Although it's unclear to me how much of that in the US is about identity, because people's attitudes among the religious right on things like morality changed the moment that Trump was nominated. So something like 73% of conservative Republicans used to think that it was important to have someone in the White House who was an upstanding person of high values. And then a recent survey after Trump got nominated, but before he was elected as president, it showed that the evangelical attitude towards that went from like 73% to 27% or something. So they do seem to be following these identity cues that are shaping their values and beliefs too.
There's one question in the back.
Adam Hurst.
Can I
ask you a clarification question about the first study with the real news, please? Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Thanks. So you said that you had different predictions from the confirmatory bias hypothesis and from the partisan beliefs hypothesis. And it wasn't quite clear to me how that came about, because I assume that your conservatives and your liberals have different values for those topics in and of themselves. I did one thing, it was quite difficult to see your graphs from where we were, so I wasn't quite sure. Could you explain again how?
Yeah. Let me pull up the figures so I can walk you through that. So the confirmation bias alternative hypothesis, I think, is the weakest one of the bunch. So I also do think confirmation bias plays a role. And I think I just want to affirm another point that you made first, which is that our beliefs, because they're woven into things like ideology and our identities, part of confirmation bias is partisan belief or ideological belief. So I don't want to be too strong in dismissing partisan beliefs. But I guess what I would say is, here's how we operationalized it in our study. I would operationalize it in terms of stereotypes. And so people in the United States have a stereotype that liberals are peace-loving or care about peace, and conservative candidates care more about security. Yeah, and so what you'd expect, if that's true, if they're confirming their stereotypes, is that they would only believe the things where Clinton supported peace and Trump supported war, for example, when it comes to the peace and security beliefs. And that's not what we found. That was moderated by identity. So we operationalize it here in terms of the stereotypes Americans have about the value system of Republicans and Democrats.
Hi, my name's Jess. I'm doing some work on immigration. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I'm just making sure I can hear everything you say.
Okay, so it's work on immigration. And you talked about the work you did analysing Twitter.
Yeah.
And tribal language that you got on Twitter. And I was wondering what kind of words people are using to describe immigration. Was there anything that you picked up?
Yeah, so we didn't look at immigration as one of our core topics. We looked at gun control, climate change, and same-sex marriage. But some of the words that we had measured, so first of all, I'll take a step back with the methods. The first thing we did is we pulled from previously validated dictionaries that were designed to study emotion. So that was based on Jamie Pennebaker's work. He had a dictionary of emotional words. And then we used separate dictionaries that were designed to study morality. And we had previously created one of those with Anna Gantman, and also Jonathan Haidt and Jesse Graham had created one. And then we basically drew a Venn diagram of these, as a metaphor, which is that some words were only emotional and only appeared in the emotional dictionary, but not the morality dictionary. Other words appeared in the morality dictionary, but not the emotional dictionary. And then a third set of words were in both dictionaries. And then we took those words, and then we ran two separate pilot studies with the different samples of participants and had them figure out, were they face valid? Could they pull apart moral emotional words from just emotional words? And could they pull apart moral emotional words from just moral words? And they could with, I think it was 95% accuracy. So those were the two ways that we validated these dictionaries. And then the words in the moral emotional dictionaries were words like hate, disgust, anger, but also positive moral emotions like love. And so that was the way that we went about creating the dictionaries and validating them. And those were some of the words that resonated, or some of the most prominent words.
Okay, why do you think the conservatives were more prejudiced?
Were more what?
Prejudiced.
Prejudiced? So that's an interesting question. There's some evidence that at least partly what's happening in the United States is people who are, so there's measures of cognitive, I don't know if you're familiar with the cognitive response test. And it's a measure of whether you're analytical or intuitive. And so David Rand and Gordon Pennycook have been doing a lot of studies on that around fake news. And they found a couple of interesting things. One is that Trump voters, which is the current Republican Party, tends to be people who score very low on the CRT. And people who voted for Clinton were very high on the CRT. And they also found that people who used to vote for Democrats, but switched over to vote for Trump, were extremely low in the CRT. So these are the people who found Trump really appealing, that were already Republicans or moved from the Democrats to Republicans in the last election, were people who are super intuitive. So it might be what we're tapping into now is there might be reasonable size differences between whether people kind of go with their gut and just follow that versus are more analytical and critical of the information they're reading. And that might be partly that selection process, might be partly what's baked into our Republican versus Democratic sample. There's also a lot of research that or people who are not Democrats or Republicans, but liberals tend to be more. I don't know I don't want to misstate it, but there's differences in cognitive style between the left and the right that are similar to that have been found in a meta-analysis by John Joes. And that came out many years before the current political climate. That also might be part of it, but that's speculating.
Yeah, hi, thanks. I just have one question. At some point, you were, I think, correctly pitting partisanship against accuracy, and I can imagine many cases where that is true, but I can also imagine evolutionary advantages to this kind of priggishness. And I was wondering if you could imagine the circumstance where that type of mentality would actually outperform, perhaps intergroup competition or something.
Yeah. So I think that happens in science. That where we identify. I mean, I'm deeply identified as a scientist. In fact, I would argue maybe that's my most important identity. And what that means is that I care a lot about truth and transparency and analysis and evidence to form my belief system, and then I try to update my ideology based on the data, the best data I get. And I know a lot of people think that, but when you're a scientist, it's not only that it's a set of values and norms that are embedded in you, but that you're trained. That's what you do a PhD. It's like a 5-year, at least in America, I guess it's a 3-year training for you. It's a multi-year training, often under a very close mentor and in a lab group like yours, where your analytic skills are constantly honed, criticized, refined, and modeled around you. And also what I would say in science that's interesting is when you look at what's happened with the last few years with the replication crisis, when people have a failed replication or something, obviously it's ambiguous a lot of times why that is, but what I've noticed when people have a failed replication of their work, if they come out and say, wow, I'm going to run a new study on this, or I'm going to really have to rethink this, they get a lot of accolades, even from people who don't like their work. But if they become hyper-resistant or try to discredit the people who did the replication, often the criticism increases and mounts. And the reason for that is that we, as scientists, we have certain norms that are embedded within our community that are attached to our identity that signal to us that if someone's not paying attention to data and they're really rigid or ideological in their belief system, like they love their theory too much, and when data contradicts it, they can't update their thinking. That's the type of person that, you know, on Twitter or used to always be just around the bar at a conference. People like that get mocked. We don't like that, and we gossip about them, in part because they're violating our community value system. So it's not that scientists are perfect, and it's not that we have that identity active all the time. When we go home, we have different identities. When we read the news, when we go to a political event, other identities are salient. So I'm not saying that we're always thinking through that lens, but when we activate that lens and we have an understanding of what that identity means and what the norms of our community are, I think it guides us in a much, much better way than any belief system in human history has ever done. So I would say, exactly to your point, that's why you're all in this room and that's why I'm on this call with you, is because all of us share that. And we might disagree around the margins, but at least we have ways developed for arbitrating our disbeliefs, disagreements.
Yes.
In regards to the propaganda, did you find any differences with liberals and conservatives, whether they're trying to strengthen their in-groups versus out-groups, or to cause more hate for out-groups or in-groups?
So I'll say this, what was remarkable, there's a lot of debate in the literature about whether liberals or conservatives are more likely to engage in motivated reasoning or more partisan. And I've written a little bit about that too. I think I would say that's the one thing some of my colleagues who normally disagree on a lot of stuff, that's the one thing they seem to agree on, is there's some differences there. But I will say that we found none in our studies. In fact, it was remarkable how similar Democrats and Republicans are in their partisanship. The effect sizes were almost identical in all the studies we ran. So here's my theory. My theory is that there might be differences between liberals and Democrats, liberals and conservatives. When you take politics out of it, you can see differences. So when we look at brain structure differences, when we look at differences on very basic cognitive tasks, like oddball tasks and stuff, you find really big effect sizes. Startle idling task, you find really big effect size differences between liberals and conservatives. Admittedly, the sample sizes of those studies are small, but you find consistent and big differences. Now, the moment you add politics in, what drives your belief system seems to be identity. Identity becomes salient, and you line up your beliefs and cognitive style around that identity to support it. And at that point, you start to see, you go from asymmetries or differences between liberals and conservatives to symmetries, and they start to act the same moment that identity becomes really powerful. And so, in my view, one of the key things to thinking about this is understanding what situations where identity is really powerful for these people and where it's not. And where it's not tends to be cases where you're more likely to see differences between the left and the right.
Is it okay if I jump in here?
Yeah, please.
So I wanted to ask about your final graph, I think, that showed that fake news was actually believed more than real news from credible news sources. And so I wondered kind of why you think that is. Do you think that, if you're making up anything, you can just make up better gossip than the truth? And like similarly, if liberals are less likely to share false news, is that actually detrimental to them?
Man, those are tough questions. So I'll say why I think fake news gets shared more. Because it's intentionally designed to trigger our morality, emotion, and identity. Whereas mainstream news, like especially if you look at really good, the best mainstream news, takes almost all those things right out of the headline, and it tends to be really dry. Like the BBC or the New York Times, most of them, or the APA, Associated Press here, that's the news source is just the facts. And it's not as interesting. It's not as engaging. It doesn't. It's less likely to get likes when we share it with our friends and family. And so the fake news is engineered to trigger these emotions in us, and therefore it's very appealing. And also, I think it has this virtue signaling function on social media, which is a big part of social media, which is that when we send it out, it clearly signals to our community what we value and who we are. Whereas when you send out some even-handed story from the BBC, it might not be clear where you stand on the story. And so I think that signaling function and also the reinforcement structure of the online environment, where you get a lot of likes, but you don't get dislikes. So if you're on Twitter, like I am, you don't get thumbs down or dislikes, but you get the hearts. So you can only hear when people like it. So what that does is it creates an incentive structure to share more and more clickbaity or incendiary things to get a lot of likes, because you're not seeing any negative feedback, or only if people comment. But you can get 100 likes on something, and let's say 200 people dislike it. You're not going to see that. You're not going to get that instant feedback saying, whoa, a lot of people like this, but it's yikes, super polarizing. So that's my thought, is that the design of these social media companies allows for reinforcement schedule that privileges fake news over mainstream news, would be one of my thoughts. And whether liberals lose out on this, they may lose out in terms of mobilizing their base for elections. I think a lot of them are taken by surprise. There's big debate in the United States about people on the left. Should they kind of go in the trenches and fight this kind of warfare? Or do they value truth enough that they're not going to do it? And so I was on a panel with somebody who runs a hyper-partisan left-wing news website and somebody from a hyper-partisan right-wing news site. And the guy from the left-wing news site still says he tries to write his headlines and his articles in the most emotionally evocative way, but he still has to go through this rigorous fact-checking. So he can't say anything technically wrong,
but he tries to frame it in this identity-driven, moral, emotional way. So that's kind of something that's an ongoing discussion. My preference is just to share better and higher quality news, and for that to get filtered out by, I think social media companies are trying to fix this, and they need to do a better job. And so that would be what I would try to fix, rather than counteracting it with more fake news.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you very much.
Okay. Any last question? Okay, okay, sure.
Hi, I was wondering if through all the news that you tried in your previous experiment, if there was something that tried to, how to say, that made both Republicans and Democrats agree on something, to find a common ground between them and where to build a little bit more, a little less polarization.
Yeah, so I think that's really a hugely important question. What we found is that they're more likely to cross-share news if it didn't have morality and emotion in it. So that's one way to do it. And a lot of people don't understand the difference between, opinion versus news, and they actually want to get higher quality news, but they don't like the opinion embedded in their news. So this is turning out to be a big issue for journalism. But I would say there was a brand new study came out in PNAS last week, and what they found is when they gave people scientific data about climate change, and they had networks of liberals and conservatives talk about it, they were able to learn a lot. And everybody's scientific understanding of that issue increased through discussion. But then they ran a condition where they gave cues to political party membership, and I can't remember the exact detail. I think they had like a donkey versus an elephant, or something that said Republican versus Democrat. And when people could see that you were on a different side than them, and that you were affiliated with a different party, scientific literacy plummeted. So again, the moment you put identity cues into the situation, people think that you're trying to convince them to change their opinion or to pursue some political agenda, and they start counter-arguing or dismissing that, or they don't pay attention, they disengage. So I think that the moment you can get political identity out of the equation and use language that's not as polarizing, then you're going to have a better foundation for talking about something, even something like climate change, which can be contentious. People are able to actually talk about the data and the science in a reasonable way once they feel like politics is removed from the equation.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm afraid we're running out of time, so let's thank our speaker again.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun. Great questions.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Jay. Cheers.
Bye. Hopefully I'll see some of you in person at a conference at some point, so be sure to say hi if I cross paths.
Yeah, it would be great.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
One at a time.